Welcome to this explainer. Today we're stepping into the shadows of a story that honestly sounds like the plot of a deeply unsettling horror movie. But I assure you, every single detail we're going to look at today is completely real. We're looking at one of India's most disturbing and mysterious cases, an incident that took place in the Burari area of Delhi. This is a case that didn't just shock a neighborhood. It brought the entire nation to an absolute standstill, desperately searching for answers where there just seemed to be none. So we're going to break down the timeline, the evidence, and the psychology behind a tragedy that totally defies human logic. Okay, let's dive into this. एक ही family के 11 लोग एक साथ कैसे मर सकते हैं? How can 11 members of a family die together? That is the chilling, central question that echoed across every news channel, every dinner table, and pretty much every street corner in India on July 1, 2018. It goes against literally every single human survival instinct we have. When one person takes their own life, it's a tragedy. But when an entire household, multiple generations, just vanishes in a single night under identical circumstances, it stops being just a tragedy and becomes a profound, terrifying mystery. How does a collective decision like this actually happen? Well, let's start by looking at who they were. The story begins with the Chandawat family, and honestly, perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire mystery is the word normal. This was not some family living on the fringes of society. They were highly respectable, everyday people living in Burari, Delhi. They were actively running a business and were deeply, deeply integrated into their local community. According to all their neighbors, they were peaceful, kept to themselves, and showed absolutely no outward signs of distress whatsoever. To the outside world, they were the absolute picture of a stable, middle-class Indian family. No one, and I mean no one, could have possibly imagined the dark reality brewing behind their closed doors. With that illusion of normalcy, it shattered completely on the morning of July 1st. When neighbors realized there was no movement in the house and got zero response after knocking, a creeping sense of dread really started to set in. The police were eventually called to the scene, and when law enforcement finally breached the entrance and stepped inside, they were met with a staggering, almost incomprehensible number. 11. 11 dead bodies inside a single home. An entire family tree just wiped out overnight. Now, what's really interesting about this discovery is the sheer organization of the space. When police entered, they didn't just find bodies. They found a highly structured scene. 10 family members were found hanging in a single room. Their faces were heavily covered, and their hands were tightly tied. The silence in that house was absolute. It was deafening. And tragically, one elderly woman, a family member, was found dead in a completely separate room. As this horrifying imagery hit the media, panic and shock spread like wildfire across the whole country. The reason the entire nation was so deeply confused becomes really obvious when we compare crime scenes. A typical mass casualty event or a violent crime scene is usually disorganized, right? There are signs of struggle, chaos, panic. But the Burari house? It was completely different. It was a highly planned, meticulously organized setup. The tied hands, the covered vases, the specific locations, none of it looked like a standard hanging or a typical crime. It looked like a methodical execution of a plan, which left investigators and the public totally bewildered. Was this a horrific mass murder or an unbelievable mass suicide? Section 1. Decoding the evidence. Diaries and dark rituals. As crime scene investigators combed through the house to uncover evidence, they recovered some incredibly strange and vital pieces. Hidden away, they found registers, diaries, and handwritten notebooks. And these weren't your normal, everyday journals. They contained incredibly detailed, step-by-step instructions for what appeared to be dark, esoteric rituals. The notebooks documented a deeply rooted, absolute blind belief system operating right there within the family. And even more chilling, the police realized that the fixed, pre-planned pattern of the hangings they found in the room perfectly matched the precise instructions written on these very pages. But here is where the story shifts from a simple mass suicide to something vastly more complex and tragic. Written right there in the notes was this exact instruction: Sab kuch temporary hoga and sab safe rahenge. Everything will be temporary and everyone will be safe. This single sentence changes literally everything. It strongly indicates that the family didn't actually intend to die that night. They believed they were participating in a temporary ritual, a test of faith, and that some supernatural force would intervene, save them, and untie them. It was, tragically, a deadly illusion. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds the psychological turning point, a fatal command system. To really understand this command system, we've got to look at the timeline of psychological control, because that is the true roadmap of this tragedy. For years prior, as we established, they lived a perfectly normal life. But the catalyst occurred with one family member, Lalit. Reports revealed that Lalit began to harbor a profound belief that he was being directly guided by the spirit of his late father. And over a slow, agonizing progression of time, he didn't just hold this belief alone. The entire family slowly began to accept it. His father's supposed voice became their ultimate truth. The climax of this timeline is terrifying. This blind faith morphed into an absolute command system. What Lalit said, or what the spirit dictated, was followed absolutely, without question. So while the physical evidence pointed to mass suicide, psychological experts look at this case through a very different lens. They highlight the overwhelming presence of psychological manipulation. Basically, this is the exercise of undue influence through mental distortion and emotional exploitation. And what does that do? It ultimately results in absolute control over a person, or in this specific case, an entire family. The Chendawats were locked in this shared psychological bubble. The boundaries of reality had been entirely erased by one member's influence, proving that, honestly, you don't need physical chains to hold someone hostage. Psychological chains are far stronger.
Section 3. The assessment. Murder or mass suicide.
To address this assessment, on one hand, we have the murder theory, which was driven heavily by public doubts. I mean, many people simply could not fathom that 11 individuals, including educated younger members, would willingly participate in this. They suspected an outsider, right? A hidden killer who orchestrated the whole scene. But contrasting that directly is the remarkably rigid police evidence pointing to mass suicide. Investigators struggle to find even a single shred of evidence pointing to an outsider. There was absolutely no forced entry, zero signs of robbery or missing valuables. Literally everything, from the materials used to the handwritten notes, pointed to an event that was entirely planned and executed from the inside.
So the crucial point is, the official police conclusion stated that the Burari case was a ritualistic mass suicide, driven entirely by inside planning and supported by a total lack of external evidence. It was an insular tragedy born out of delusion. However, it's really important to acknowledge that human nature naturally seeks neat, logical explanations. And because of the downright bizarre nature of this case, even today, there are plenty of people who feel the complete, unvarnished truth might still be partly obscured in the shadows.
Section 4. The takeaway. Impact on mental health and society. And this brilliantly illustrates the crucial steps we, as a society, have to take to ensure a deeply disturbing event like this is never repeated. First, we must never, ever ignore mental health issues. What starts as a small quirk or delusion can clearly spiral into a fatal command system. Second, we've got to actively recognize and educate against the severe dangers of unchecked blind faith and superstition. Third, we really need to prioritize family counseling and open lines of communication, just so that isolated bubbles of delusion can't form in the first place. And finally, society absolutely must provide immediate, stigma-free support for emotional trauma before it transforms into something unrecognizable and ultimately deadly.
You know, the Burari mystery remains one of India's most haunting cases because it completely shatters our deepest assumptions about safety. We lock our doors, we install cameras, and we fear the stranger on the street. But this tragedy teaches us a terrifying lesson. The danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes the most potent threat grows silently, unseen and undetected right inside the human mind, gradually destroying a family from within.
We've looked at the evidence, the diaries, the psychological manipulation, and the official conclusions. We've seen how the mind can build a reality so detached from the truth that it literally becomes fatal. Yet, given the unbelievable scale of this tragedy and the sheer weight of the delusion, it leaves us with a pretty heavy, lingering thought. As you process all the facts we've just uncovered, I want to leave you with this final question to ponder. Kya Burari case surf suicide tha ya kuch aur? Was it just suicide or something else entirely? Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.